Hello, and welcome to More Influence and Impact, the show that unlocks the secret of success for multiple 6 and 7 figure entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Celia Faye Meisel, sales growth consultant, and I'm here to help you tap into the wealth of knowledge, strategies, and experiences of today's most influential industry leaders. Today, I have Dr. Adia Gooden on as a guest. Hello, Dr. Adia.
Hi, Celia. It's so good to be here with you.
Excited to have you. And so, Dr. Adia is a licensed clinical psychologist, speaker, and author. She co authored the book Promoting Black Women's Mental Health and gave a TEDx talk called Cultivating Unconditional Self Worth, which has over 1 million views. Dr. Adia hosts the Unconditionally Worthy podcast and coaches high achieving professional women to embrace their unconditional self worth. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Awesome. So excited to talk about my favorite topic with you.
Your absolute favorite. And, in a time right now where we're hearing the terms mental health, epidemic, and burnout, and all of these pieces, this conversation is so timely. And so I know with you, creating this message and this business around this, let's talk a little bit about your journey and your story that led you to where you are today.
Sure. So, kind of starting when I was pretty young, I felt like I wasn't worthy. I wasn't lovable. I sort of, had experiences of being left out. I was never bullied. I didn't experience any sort of large T trauma, but I always sort of felt like I wasn't really good enough or I wasn't totally lovable. People didn't truly love and like who I was. And so starting from that young age, I was kind of like, okay, well, let's try to figure out how to prove to the world that I'm worthy. And that looked like perfectionism and academic achievement and trying to be the perfect friend and all of these things. And it really came to a head for me in graduate school and really at the end of graduate school, because I had sort of kind of concluded that, okay, if I get my PhD, and I was on track to get my PhD before I was 30, then that was going to finally make me feel worthy. Like this was it. All the other things hadn't seemed to work yet, but this was going to be the thing. And I defended my dissertation, passed my dissertation defense, and walked out of the room, slumped into a chair, and started sobbing, because I knew immediately that this pursuit of external achievements in order to make myself feel worthy or to prove that I was worthy hadn't worked. And this was like that final sort of frontier of like, this has got to work, and it didn't work. And I felt empty inside still. And so that really set me on a path to trying to figure out like, well, if it's not all this external stuff, what is it, right? And it wasn't necessarily always a clear and conscious path, but I really started to look inward and to explore kind of how I was treating myself, how I was seeing myself, started using some of what I was learning as a clinical psychologist trainee, and applying that to myself. And so that's really what got me sort of on this path of thinking about unconditional self-worth. And then when I was working with clients, particularly high achieving students, I was seeing that they were experiencing the same challenges that I was. And I realized, oh, like it's not just me. This is more of a, broad or universal challenge that people have. And then I was offering them skills and resources and strategies that was working for them and had worked for me. And that's what has led me into this work of wanting to really spread the message that everyone's unconditionally worthy and give people the tools and the strategies to believe that for themselves.
Yes. And so in the last year, you actually closed your practice and went full time in your coaching to really help, and empower these high achieving, successful professional women in their own lives.
Yeah, exactly. I, had gotten to a place where some of the expectations and norms in therapy felt somewhat constraining, didn't feel totally aligned with
Mhm.
how I want to share. And I think there's a lot of value in therapy. And I'm so grateful for all the people who do it. And I think it's a great resource for people. And I was finding that I wanted to offer something bigger and something beyond that and something a little bit more structured. And so that's what I do now with my Unconditionally Worthy group coaching program.
Yes, taking that into that transformation because you have the tools and all the resources. And so, really, in you sharing your journey, something clicked for me. And I was like, okay, well, I should have probably thought of that before. But it's like, when we are so basically before and when women are coming to you, it's like they place conditions on their worthiness. So in that story of like your journey of, when I get my PhD and I have this condition, I'll be worthy, and then it hit you like, oh my gosh, this is not true at all.
Exactly. Right. Like I talk about conditional self-worth, and we usually have a lot of conditions, right? It
Yeah.
could be how you look, how much money you make, whether you're in a relationship, if we're thinking about women, like, do you have kids? Are you married? It could be other people approving of you and you being a wonderful sister or mom or wife, right? Like there's so many conditions that many of us have been socialized to believe this is what makes me worthy. I'm always the giver. I always have it together. I always get things right, right? Like all of these things. And then, we either can overwork or overextend ourselves to try to meet these conditions, but still feel like it's not giving us the sense of worthiness that we're desiring, or we fail to meet those conditions and we feel awful about ourselves.
Yeah, so there's just so many rules that we put up, and yeah, and then it creates so much internal pain, and it doesn't have to be there. So let's talk about, where does one find worthiness? Where does it come from? Because if it's not going to come from the PhD and the 100K a month and the viral marketing post, where does it come from?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, I believe that it comes from within. And, depending on people's sort of faith or spirituality, there may be sort of different words or names that you sort of use to label it. I sort of like talking about the light within. I also encourage people to think about a baby, right? Like if you think about a newborn baby, they have not accomplished anything, right? Like they cannot do anything for themselves, right? Like they really need help with every aspect of their lives, right? You got to change their diaper. You probably have to help them feed. And maybe they know they can latch and find a nipple. Like
Yeah.
maybe they can do that, right? But generally, they haven't sort of accomplished anything in the traditional sense. But I think if you asked anyone, is this baby worthy, unconditionally worthy of love and care and taking up space? The answer would be universally yes,
Yeah.
right? There would be no, well, I don't know, the baby didn't make me
Mhm.
smile today. Or, I mean, can't even hold its head up. I don't think so, right? Like, it would be yes, right? There is something within that baby that makes it worthy, right?
Mhm.
And what I try to help people understand is that you had that in you when you were born, and there is nothing that you did and there's nothing that happened to you that could take that away. So it's still in you, and it's really about reconnecting to that truth, that part of you that was always worthy, and taking off the things that have blocked you from that truth that you're worthy.
Yes. And so just removing all of that. And so if somebody comes to you and, because I work with a lot of business owners that are in that transformational space. And usually when you're working with the high achievers in particular, and I know we have a lot of high achievers that are listening and watching, and usually their mind is to like chase the achievement, right? So I'm going to go for another coaching program, or I'm going to go for another certification, and they're sort of running from this thing inside of them that's calling them home, because they're still kind of chasing the conditions to be worthy. So when someone comes to you and they're ready to take that step and invest and get the coaching, like what are some of the patterns and the things that you see in their lives that show them, okay, maybe chasing the achievements isn't the right thing for me anymore. Just
Hmm.
so some of our listeners can really say like, oh my gosh, maybe this is me, and this is the next step for me.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things is having achieved a lot of the things that you set out to achieve or society told you you should achieve. And then sort of feeling like there's a constant, the bar is raised, right? So it's like, okay, well, I did this. I got to this level. Maybe it's this level of income in your business or this certification or this degree or whatever it is. And then very quickly feeling like you've got to get something else, right? So
Mhm.
always sort of feeling like you're chasing. And I encourage people to think like, how long did the satisfaction or the feeling of pride around a given accomplishment last? And often it is very short, right? Like often it's like a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks before people are like, okay, it's the next thing. And that usually is a sign that you're trying to sort of fill an internal sense of emptiness with something external that's never going to be able to fill it. So I would say that's one thing. I also think if you're feeling burned out, overextended, exhausted, but also kind of unfulfilled, right? So there's this sort of like overstimulated in some ways, but undernourished, right? Like if we could
Mhm.
say it in that way. So it's like you're doing a lot of things, people are asking you for a lot of things, you're busy. But then if you tuned in to say, am I doing something that's meaningful? And am I feeling alive? Am I feeling connected? Those things aren't happening. So there's sort of this weird contrast that might also be a sign, right? Of actually it's something inward. It's not just filling your plate with more responsibilities and more activities. It's not just doing more for other people. It's actually about sort of tuning in and seeing what's the deeper question that needs to be answered or space that needs to be filled. The last thought I had is you mentioned, right, like people chasing certifications and doing all of those things. And while I certainly think it's helpful to have training and useful
Mhm.
to pursue certifications if they're appropriate, I think sometimes we rely more on these external trainings and skills than trusting our own internal wisdom and knowledge. And that is such an important part of doing impactful work, right? That we need the external training and that's useful, but at some point it's enough and we've got to again turn inward and value the wisdom and the knowledge that we have that comes from within.
Yes. Oh my gosh, just so much gold there, Adia. Thank you for all of that. And in what you were sharing, like what I'm seeing is it's counterintuitive because it's like when you're chasing those achievements, there is truly a threshold there, and you're not going to go and reach your potential. And there's always going to be a limit of what you can do, especially there's usually self sabotage and coping mechanisms and all of these harmful behaviors that are at play that are driving that. And true, I mean, all of this, I have been that person before of I had the business on paper. Everybody just thought, oh my gosh, Celia has it together and her business, she's got this great business. And then my health completely just
Mm.
deteriorated. And I was very young. I was in my early 30s. That was 10 years ago. And I just completely like reinvented my life after that, and people couldn't understand, and it was because I had gotten the degree, I had started the business, I was married, we had bought our first home, like all of the things on paper were there, and inside like I was so miserable and unhappy. And it took me like kind of losing my health to really
Mm.
see, and like no one should have to get to that breaking point where it gets that bad. We didn't, I back then, like it seems like so long ago, it wasn't that long ago, but like the education around coaching and mental health and the resources and the information that we have today is just so much greater than it was then. I think that with coaching and mentorship, it would have been different for me. So I really relate to this journey of and just again, just want to bring it back to like there truly is a threshold and a limit on what you can achieve when you're living your life in that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I so appreciate you sharing your own experience because I think people don't think about sustainability. And I
Right.
think some people are often driven by, I've got to prove, I've got a chip on my shoulder, I'm going to push myself and critique myself and criticize myself, and that's what makes me, gives me an edge, and that's what makes me successful. And it's like, okay, it may work for a little bit of time, but it's not sustainable. It is
Mm-mm.
not aligned with being fully healthy and well. And I actually don't think that we truly create our best work from a place of negative self-criticism, of pushing ourselves like beyond, right? Like overworking ourselves and overextending ourselves. It's like, yeah, we may be able to like pull something together, but will you truly feel like that's your best work? I know I don't feel like I do my best work in a rushed, frantic,
No.
stressed space. Like it's never the best work. But if I'm rested and if I trust myself and if I take the time and I wrestle with something, right? Like that's usually when I produce my best work. When I'm rested, I'm also a better coach. When I'm in tune with my intuition and my inner wisdom, I'm a better coach versus if I'm like trying to prove or like, I got to show you all the ways I can be a great coach, right? So even we think about like the energy that you sort of are aligned with, it's like, what is actually aligned with success and true sustainable success versus like quick wins that aren't sustainable.
Yes, yes. The sustainability piece is massive. And I think too there's like the pushing versus the receiving. And
Mm,
when you're talking about being rested and nourished and all of those things, like when we're like achieving and we're going and we're pushing, it's like there's so much like manipulation and force that goes
mm,
into it. And I call that being very ego driven. And that's not always like what's best for you. And if you're in a coaching business and like that's not always like the best way that you're going to receive, if you're doing that with your marketing and your sales. And so there's like the softening that really is where like the gold is being soft. And then you can receive, because if like back to the certifications, if we're chasing this and I need this and I need that and blah, 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 versus like when you slow down and you get quiet and you realize you are worthy, you are enough and more, you can actually start to receive those things that are going to nourish you. So when your clients come to you, is there sort of like an unwinding process that you take them
mm.
through? Because it seems like, going from like 100 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour can be a big shift. So tell us a little bit about that journey that you take your clients on.
That is such a good question. So, I have a framework that I've developed that guides people on their journey to unconditional self worth. And the first part of the framework is really about freeing yourself. And it's about freeing yourself from the stories that you've been told about what makes you worthy or unworthy and the stories that you've told yourself. And what I found from my coaching clients is that even in like the first module where we're talking about like writing your self-worth story, like what has impacted your self-worth up till now, let's get very clear on it, let's put it together so you can see it, is really impactful. Because so often all of this stuff is sort of in the back of our consciousness, right? Like operating in the background. And when we sort of look at it, then we can see it. And so I think of that as sort of the unwinding. It's like, what do you need to what do you need to let go of and free yourself from so that you can then sort of continue to move on this journey, right? Like, what are the patterns? What are the conditions that you've put on your worth? That's another thing we focus on. We talk about self-forgiveness. We talk about releasing self-criticism, right? So like releasing all of these things that kind of keep us stuck in a mode of
Mhm.
exhaustion and overworking and not trusting ourselves, releasing those things, freeing ourselves from those things so that we then can move into loving ourselves, accepting ourselves, affirming ourselves. And then the last portion is being ourselves, right? How do we show up as our authentic self? How do we tune into our internal wisdom so that that can be the guide instead of all of
Mm.
these external things or the fears that were guiding us before? So I do kind of love that framing, that it is sort of like slow down. What do we need to release and let go of? How do we love and care for ourselves? And then how do we show up in the world and be ourselves?
Yes. And, I think that I see it in particular with women we take on all of these identities and these personas, and they're familial, they're cultural, they're ancestral, and so it's that unwinding, and then who we think we are and who we think how we should show up. And so we have to retrain ourselves, and I like to use that term, unwind. And would you say that your clients, that they're ignoring their inner wisdom and they're ignoring their intuition when they come to you and they meet you?
Yes, definitely. I think most people have lost trust with themselves.
Mm.
And right, whether it's making decisions that you now look back on and say, how could I have made that decision? Why did I get myself into that? Right. So that's where we kind of work through self forgiveness, because
Mhm.
that has to be released. And you have to sort of see what was going on that guided you to make that decision. So you can start rebuilding trust with yourselves. But I think when we believe that the outside world is going to determine our worth, or these conditions are going to determine our worth, and then we set ourselves on a path of overworking and achieving and perfectionism, usually that disconnects us from ourselves and our truth and our wisdom. And so it is a process of how do we rebuild trust. And I have exercises on tuning into your intuition and connecting to your values, right? So that people have a framework for what is your inner wisdom and how do you get there, because there is this trust that has been broken through the criticism, through the not honoring your body and what it needs, through not caring yourself, that we rebuild. And then it's like, okay, well, how do you use that moving forward?
Yes, and it's like just shifting life tracks. I mean, you're getting onto a whole new. I mean, I know from when I shared earlier, like what happened with my health, like I couldn't live my life the same way and do things the same way and be and operate the same way. Like I'm literally like totally different person, and we need our providers and our coaches and our mentors to help us guide us onto that new path, because it looks different than what we were taught by society and from our family and the education system, because that sort of drive is really what's promoted. And so there's this other way. So I love that you're giving your clients the tools and the resources and the path to step onto so they can start living these lives. And I'm sure that the transformations are absolutely incredible. Could you just give us an example of like somebody who, obviously no names or anything, but just somebody that maybe like came in with this exact kind of persona that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think about, one of my former coaching clients who was in a space of like, worked in a corporate environment, like high intensity corporate environment, was in a place where, she wasn't able to take time to take care of her body and move her body in the way that she wanted. And she didn't trust herself. And she was, being really harsh and critical with herself. And she, through the program, moved into a place where she was, starting to make time for movement and exercise that felt really good, not punishing, which is what
Mhm.
she had sort of been doing intermittently before, but exercise that felt good and honored her body and her needs day to day, self-compassion, taking trips for herself. And then now she recently told me that she's transitioning into sort of an academic role that she has wanted to do for a really long time. And right, like taking this leap to make a transition that really is more in line with what she wants to do, how she wants to show up in the world. And so she's, it's like scary, but really exciting and really powerful that she could make that shift happen, because that's no easy feat. And so I feel like she's an example of someone who was already doing very well, right? Like on the outside,
Yeah.
doing very well, but then learn to honor herself and trust her intuition and be kind and compassionate. And then that's helped her make, a successful career shift that's, challenging, and this great opportunity that she's created for herself.
Yes, thank you for sharing that example, because it's like it's that acting out of love, like making choices and making decisions and taking leaps and risks out of love for ourselves versus, out of scarcity and lack. So beautiful. So tell us, do we connect with you further? How do people connect with you? Where do they go to find you?
Yeah. So, You can always check out my website, which is dradiagooden.com. I'm also active on LinkedIn under Dr. Adia Gooden and on Instagram at Dr. Adia Gooden. And if anybody's sort of curious about this self-worth thing and getting there, I'd love to share my free ebook, which you can find, which is on 4 practices to connect to your unconditional self-worth. And you can find that on my website, dradiagooden.com/free ebook.
Perfect. And we will have all of the links in the show notes so people can go click away. And then also tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so I recently co-authored a book which was published by Cambridge University Press. It's called Promoting Black Women's Mental Health: What Practitioners Should Know and Do. And so it's really a book that's designed to help practitioners, clinicians, therapists, physicians, people who work with Black women to provide culturally responsive care.
Mm-hmm.
And we also think it's going to be a very valuable book for Black women themselves to understand the nuances of their experience and challenges. It has a lot of resources and tools and practices that will be helpful for both people working with Black women and for Black women themselves. So it's available now.
Wow, so beautiful and such a needed resource. So I'm so excited that this is out in the world. And where do people go and find the book?
So it's on Amazon. So you can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it on Bookshop, and you can also buy it on the Cambridge website.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Adia. It's just been a joy and delight to talk with you and hear your vast knowledge and experience and your expertise. And I know that everyone is going to get so much value and is getting so much value out of this. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is Celia Faye Meisel with More Influence and Impact, and we will see you next time.